Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
I think we are guilty of generational child abuse with the way we are treating the planet and what we are giving our children and grandchildren.
Coming up on Dialogue, a conversation with nationally known physician and PBS host Richard Jackson about how our built environment could actually be shortening our lives. That's Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin in downtown Boise, Idaho. This area is now bustling with activity. But in the 1980s, it was full of vacant properties. Tax incentives and a population boom changed all that, as well as design and planning elements called smart growth and the new urbanism. The idea was to give a feeling of intimacy by emphasizing walking and cycling, as well as smaller mixed-use developments. Many other communities are struggling to regain or even create that sensibility. My guest today says that not only makes good business sense, but is also good for our lives. He's Dr. Richard Jackson, a professor of public health at UCLA and the former top physician for health and environment at the Centers for Disease Control. Dr. Jackson was also the host of a PBS series called Designing Healthy Communities. In 2016, he was in Boise to address the Urban Land Institute. I spoke with him on the campus of Intermountain Gas, whose buildings have won awards for their open and innovative architectural design. Well, welcome to Boise. It's so nice to have you here. You've been here before.
I love it here.
Well, let's first talk and tell our viewers about how you, as a physician, got interested in the built environment. Because prior to that, you were just like any other physician, really focused on disease, symptoms of disease, curing disease. But there was a bit of a light bulb moment for you, wasn't there?
You know, Marcia, I'm a pediatrician, and in pediatrics, we think about the child as a movie. And in adult medicine, you're looking at one frame, but in pediatrics, you're really looking at the trajectory of that child's life. And one of the most important things you can do in helping a family raise a child is anticipatory guidance. These are the things you're in for. These are the ways you need to change the environment to make it safer, make it healthier, more stimulating in a positive way for a child. And I did environmental health for a dozen years or so, and eventually went to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta in 1994. It was a very big job. It was the highest health and environment job in the country. And over time, I began to realize I was focused on things that were very small, atoms of lead, molecules of chemicals, or things are very big, like chemical weapons or the climate change. But we weren't paying enough attention to the actual physical environments where people were living, where children were growing up, where we were putting our elderly at different times in life. And that's when I became kind of obsessed with this.
You have said, we have created an America that is making us unhealthy, and we could not have designed an environment that is more difficult for people's well-being at this point.
The world that we have built is the result of policies we've had, tax policies, building policies, even racial policies to an extent. And we've built America in the last century around the needs of cars. We knew how to build very good communities in the United States before about 1940, and then we decided that all our problems would be fixed if everybody gets in a car and spends large portions of time in a car. And we're paying the dues for that. Average American weighs too much, is not exercising enough, doesn't have enough time in their lives. A lot of people are spending an hour or two each day just commuting back and forth to work. So thinking about the causes of chronic diseases in our population is what I've been spending a lot of time thinking about.
When we think about these effects that you're talking about, it's pretty staggering, isn't it? I mean, diabetes is what, we're spending 2% of the GMP on treatment of diabetes. We're seeing children who never had adult diseases get them, like this type 2 diabetes. It's
You know, I'm a pediatrician. When I was in training, I'd go to the children's diabetes clinic, and all the children would have juvenile diabetes, the type that was dependent on insulin treatment. Nowadays, you go to the diabetes clinic, and half the kids have type 2, what we used to call adult onset diabetes. And the survival of these children is worse than the children with the juvenile insulin-dependent diabetes. And we're seeing in our adult population about 12%. Can you imagine this? 1 in 8 American adults have diabetes, and another 35 to 40% have what we call pre-diabetes. So we're looking at an avalanche of people quite ill with a very costly disease, both personally and economically.
When you talk
In fact, let me just stay with obesity. A third of American adults are obese, and another third are overweight. So this is adding to this burden of disease we're talking about.
I looked up Idaho. Idaho's 23rd in the country on these statistics having
About
to do with
average,
obesity,
yeah.
about in the middle. 30% of its population is considered overweight, but I noted that it's jumped from only 9% in 1990, which isn't that long ago. So there's been, I don't know if they've changed the level of what's considered overweight, but there's been quite a jump just from 1990 to 2013 in Idaho, where people are outdoors more.
We've done two things that have really, I believe, have really added to the obesity epidemic. Number one, we've changed the American diet, and we've got far too much sugar in it. For $1.25, you can get 12 teaspoons of sugar dissolved in water. And this is what the pediatricians say, children should not be drinking sweetened beverages, number one. We've got too much carbohydrates, sugars in our diet. And number two, we're not exercising enough. And in fact, the level of physical activity has been dropping dramatically in the US population. And simply doctors wagging their fingers at people, it doesn't really work. And so one of the arguments I make is we have to construct environments that entice people to be physically active, that make us want to walk. Buildings with beautiful stairways, where you want to go up the stairs rather than standing there waiting for an elevator. And so I think there are a lot of things we could do in our environment, our advertising environment, our food environment, our physical environment, our built environment, that could help make us healthier.
Well, interesting, the campus that we're on right now, the building is on the Intermountain Gas campus. It's one of these open campuses with that used to be built more with green space, and if you have to get to another building, you have to walk to that building. No elevators, because it's all single levels. So this is more the way that it used to be when land wasn't at such a premium, these green spaces for people. I assume it makes for a more productive employee, too.
There are a number of things that really help people to be more productive. One is actually being able to see nature. And this is true for adults, it's true for children. I always love the fact that people say, oh, it doesn't matter if you have a window view, and then all the well-paid executives go off and are in the corner office with the nature view. Probably one of the worst things we ever did to children in America, and I'm not exaggerating. In the 1950s and 60s, we decided the kids would learn better if there were no windows in schools. And schools were built without windows. Children are more likely to go to sleep, to listen poorly, and to be hyperactive in environments where they don't have nature contact. Some wonderful studies out of Illinois where schools, they actually correlated the schools, they adjusted for race and everything else, but the schools that had windows that looked out on nature, the performance on SATs and other academic tests were better in the schools that had the green view. The second most common disorder in America is depression. And our grandparents, great-grandparents, knew how to deal with mild to moderate depression. And the way you deal with it is to be physically active, to be with other people, festivals and the things we do to create a feeling of community and being together is good for our health. And thinking that we're going to fix our problems by taking a pill every day to deal with depression, in fact, physical activity and socializing, especially in nature, is as good as any of the mild to moderate SSRIs, the drugs for it. But it's also important that people connect to their roots, their grandparents, their family, their children, and to really belong. And that's not artificial. It is as essential to our lives as vitamin C, as to be connected with each other.
Well, let's talk about the built environment a little bit more. You talked about how so much of what we're doing in America is for the car. And of course, we see it in Idaho as well. We've got freeways that are, and highways that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger as more people move here. But people want, in many instances, to live someplace away from the city, in a suburb. You know, and here the commutes seem smaller, or shorter rather, than many Californians who come here are used to. So and they want the suburban home. They want the 3-car garage. Are you saying that we shouldn't have that or want that as Americans?
People buy where they live for basically 3 reasons. 1, it's where they grew up. 2, it's what they can afford. And 3, it's schools. I guess the 4th is really safety. And in the past, it was perceived that
price too.
Urban spaces were, downtown Oakland wasn't as safe as being out in the suburbs, and people moved to the suburbs. What we found, though, is actually your risk of dying in a pool of blood is higher if you are a long-distance commuter than it is if you're living in an urban area in the United States, which is odd to say it, but we all run a 1 in 100 chance in our lifetime of dying in a car crash. And so there are a lot of things. Number 2, people ought to live where they want, but in many ways we've been told this is the good life. Have a big house, have a home theater, drive into your garage, have the garage door open, have it closed, never meet any of your neighbors, and you'll be much happier with this. And then we wonder why when they show up at the doctor's office out of shape, overweight, and depressed, and they say, gee, life's no fun. I say, well, maybe you haven't encountered life yet, and diving back into it. So I'm not saying that urban spaces are best for everyone, but people are voting with their feet. Downtown areas are keeping their economic value far better than distant areas. A car costs you about $10,000 a year in owning it. That's money you're not putting towards an equity in your home, equity in your homes. So there are a lot of young people don't want to be spending a lot of money in a car, just burning it up like gasoline, but burning money up, but actually being in places where they can be with their friends. And so the urban lifestyle is appealing to them more and more. Part of the problem for them is oftentimes the urban schools aren't very good, and people do vote with school on terms of schools.
You have an interesting segment in your documentary called Retrofitting Suburbia, in which you show that some suburbs are kind of bringing in a more urban feel of community and closeness and density and festivals to re-energize a suburb and frankly get people to know each other.
It's very interesting. The old inner cities that people didn't want to go to in 1960 are now developing beautifully. I mean, Brooklyn, places that were selling for $25,000 are now selling for $3 million. The next ring out, the first set of suburbs that were built in the 1950s, have lost their value substantially for a number of reasons. There are a lot of shopping malls in those areas, and I'm told by experts in this that America is over-malled. It has something like 50% of the malls really can't make it any longer. And so people are looking at what can we do with this? Could we turn this into a school? Could we turn this into some other kind of setting to add to this? And many cities I've visited are dealing with this same set of issues. In many ways you have to see what people really want. And oftentimes say, oh, I just want the mall back. And the mall can't stay in business. They don't have enough traffic to really do it, people going through. And yet this is a huge amount of land, probably 3/4 of it's asphalt parking lot that needs to be turned into something that people can use. In Kane County, Illinois, they're actually planting gardens, organic gardens around some of these spots where they ripped up the asphalt.
Going back to young people, it is interesting. I've met quite a few of them who just don't want to get a car because of the insurance and everything. So maybe things are changing. When you look,
our young people have a very strong environmental ethic too. They do not want to be burning fossil fuels. They'd rather be burning fat. I look at my students and how socially committed they are, and the breadth of their knowledge, the things they know about, because of basically the computer allowing them to scan multiple sources of knowledge is profound. So I actually think we're going to see serious leadership from this next generation of millennials.
So the tide may be turning in a way. I know you focus on several amazing young people in your documentary series. one of whom really touched me. She was quite overwhelmed when she worked very hard on a project to help her community, and not that many adults showed up to hear her present the project. There are quite a number of young people really working hard on this, aren't there?
I was very touched by that. The young woman was a 12th grader. She was doing a project on the trees of Elgin, Illinois, and thought about, oxygen and CO2 and the benefits, and they invited the whole town to come to the high school's presentations, and she stood up to present, and only 3 people had shown up, and she burst into tears.
If one person in the whole world comes to me and says to me, "I've changed because of you," then I am all good if it's just one person. But if I can reach out to more people, then that would be great.
And the message was, doesn't the older generation realize what they're doing to us? Don't they care about the planet that we are being given? And in the video series, I say, I think we are guilty of generational child abuse with the way we are treating the planet and what we are giving our children and grandchildren.
I know at one point you studied to be a Jesuit priest. Is this a moral issue for you, the way that our built environments might affect a person's health?
It's interesting. Pope Francis thinks about this a lot, and I believe that sins of omission are as serious as sins of commission. And we quickly think about, we shouldn't be doing these things wrong, but it takes a lot of insight and self-awareness to realize, oh, I should have been doing more of that. And I think our grandchildren are going to have a very tough time forgiving us for our negligence when it comes to caring for their planet.
So you do see it as a moral issue then?
Oh, I think it's definitely a moral issue. No one, in the Bible it says, what man would give his child a stone when he asked for bread? And we are, in essence, stealing from our grandchildren.
It seems like such a vast issue when you look at it. All the highways we've built and other things that might keep people from exercising or breathing correctly. It seems almost insurmountable to go back and try and retrofit things. But how do you approach this, the vastness of this issue?
One is, don't expect it to get better in 6 months or 3 years. It's going to take a generation or two. It took us that long to create what we've already created. I think we'll be looking at many more highly efficient energy sources. At this point, solar is on a par with many of the fossil fuels. That's going to continue. It's been dropping. The cost of solar has been dropping dramatically. I fly into Los Angeles frequently. It's ridiculous not to have solar panels on the top of every warehouse and every building in most of our environments, number one. I worked in California at the State Health Department, went to Sacramento once a week for 15 years. I hated it there. There were scarcely any trees. It was endlessly paved over. It was one-way streets heading up to the freeways out of town. This town had no heart to it. 20 years later, they've got two-way streets. All the buildings have residential, so they expect people to be living downtown. They put in restaurants. They put in farmers markets, lively restaurants. The young people who can't afford to live in San Francisco are pouring into that area, and it's now become a really lively, appealing place for people to live. And I've seen the same trajectory in Boise, where big improvements. I hope the people of Idaho are very proud of what this city has done.
What would you say to a person who lives in rural America, and a lot of Idaho is rural, who says, that's the cities, or that's the suburbs. Why should I care about that? In fact, I live on a farm, and I know my neighbors, and that's why I've chosen this lifestyle, because I do want to stay fit and connected. So why should it bother me of what's happening in the rest of the country in this respect?
One of the best things we can do for people that live in farming and rural areas is to create high-quality, dense cities so we don't continue to metastasize across the best farmland in the world as we continue to spread out with very inefficient, energy-efficient, fuel-efficient developments. So I think in some ways the best thing they could have is to have people really be happy in the city and to stay there so they can be happy in a healthy environment. And if they choose to grow organic food and know their neighbors and have a support structure, God bless them. That sounds like a very sensible lifestyle.
It's interesting. There's this thought that maybe there'll be climate refugees one day, and that places that are more sparsely populated, like Idaho, actually will have many more people moving here because other places will be underwater, frankly.
Unfortunately, it'll be under salt water. And just recently, more recent reports, we're probably looking at a 1 to 2 meter increase. That's 6-7 feet increase in sea level in my granddaughter's lifetime, which means that large parts of Florida, the East Coast, parts of California are not going to be habitable. And anytime 10,000 people move, it's a mess. Anytime 1 million move, it's awful. And anytime, and we are looking at potentially 500 million climate refugees, probably in the next 100 to 150 years. The impacts on human well-being will be substantial. I think Idaho is not going to be quite as big a destination as the Great Lakes areas because they still have plenty of fresh water. And water is going to be the big battle in the 21st, towards the end of the 21st century.
I wanted to ask you about one thing that does seem to be moving pretty quickly, and that is creating green belts in cities and places where people can bike and walk. And even in rural areas, there's a wonderful bike path called the Weiser River Trail here that goes through several rural counties. And at first there was resistance to it, and now people have really accepted it and love walking on it, and then it attracts tourism as well. So it seems like we are seeing there's been a tipping point on the cycling issue in some respects with these green belts that are coming in.
You know, Marcia, we've found that if we want people to get control of their weight and to exercise, the thing that works most poorly is to go like this. And the thing that works best is to really create food that's healthy and attractive that people want to eat, to create places where people want to get out and exercise and to be, whether it's a school campus with beautiful windows or the green belt near a city. People that live near a park, near a walking trail, walk and bike 4 times as much as the people who don't. So creating these environments is an issue of not simply activity, it's also an issue of equity. Poor people have much poorer access to this than wealthy people. There's something else I want to say quickly, that you would think rural people would exercise more than urban people. It's not true. New York City people have gained less weight over the last generation than the rest of Americans because you have to be physically active to live in New York City.
There is some resistance in communities to bike lanes. People who drive sometimes seem to get very irritated with these increasing bike lanes. Now I know some cities have set them off so that they're in their own space away from the cars. But there are political clashes, let's just say, on that issue.
We're seeing those clashes deeply around my university, UCLA. There's an upscale, wealthy, older population living nearby, and they don't want the bicycles on the road. The bicyclists are almost universally young, although more and more older men and women are also bicycling, so we're seeing that. But this is going to go on for quite a while. The lanes don't need to be 12 feet wide. You can get by with a 10.5 foot lane. People need to have bike lanes. My pet peeve, and they do this in Los Angeles, they paint flat white bicycles on the roadway in the car lane and tell people you should bike on this. I think they're ridiculous. Actually, there's some evidence they might be dangerous. I think we need to actually have protected bike lanes.
What about paying for all this? Paying to put in green belts, paying to put in bike lanes, paying to put in belt lines as is being built in Atlanta right now. Retrofitting suburbs and filling in these abandoned mall spaces. More taxes?
Good question. Well, paint is cheap. So painting the lanes and doing those changes are relatively inexpensive. The thinking is very important that goes into it. 2 is we're spending 18 to 19% of all the money in the United States on medical care, and anything we can do to reduce, particularly these chronic diseases like obesity, diabetes, asthma, the ones we've been talking about, that's a huge amount of money, and we got to think about doing it. There's been a big investment in putting prevention to work. About $500 million was put in place about 4 or 5 years ago. and the return on investment looks to be about 20 times as much. Infrastructure, it doesn't matter whether it's a new bridge or whatever it is, the return on investment is slower. It's not like business where you want to recoup your investment in the first 6 to 10 months. It takes a while. What's happened around bike lanes is the value of housing, and it's happened around parks too. The value of housing is higher near those amenities. You look at the real estate listings and they will say, near the bike lane. It has a wonderful walk score. People are actually using it as a marketing tool rather than seeing it as an unfair cost.
Do you think that gas tax, federal gas tax, state gas taxes needs to increase?
If I burn fossil fuel and I put particulates, I put CO2, I put other things into the air, I'm impacting the health of other people. I should be paying extra for the costs I'm imposing on society, on the planet. British Columbia put a $5 a ton tax on carbon. It doesn't amount to very much. It comes down to about 30 cents a gallon. They've reduced their carbon use, coal, oil, and gas, by about 5%. The rest of Canada went up 13%, and their economy got better because they're using those dollars. Because people are smart. If I can get by on a bike and save money, I'm going to do that. People are moving away from just burning fossil fuels to meet their life needs.
You focused part of your documentary on one city that you think is doing really well, and that's Charleston. Why do you think that?
Leadership matters. Charleston was not a place that was particularly appealing 35 years ago, 40 years ago. It got a terrific mayor in Joe Riley. He had a vision. They wanted to build all these high-rises along the bayfront for Charleston, and he said, no, that's going to be parkland. We want to welcome everybody in our community to be near the water, to be in a beautiful place. My favorite quote of the entire series was when I asked Mayor Riley, what should we build? And he said, we should build places that are just as nice as anywhere someone would want to visit. And I think maybe that's a big takeaway, is we need to build places that are just as nice as where you'd want to go on a trip to visit.
Well, I want to thank you for taking some of your time while you're here in Boise to talk with me and my viewers. Thank you very much. Enjoy your visit.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you, Marcia.
You've been listening to Dr. Richard Jackson, a professor of public health at UCLA. Dr. Jackson was the top physician for health and the environment at the Centers for Disease Control and was also the host of a PBS series called Designing Healthy Communities. For more information, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.